Hello everyone, welcome to The World Today on CGTN. I'm Zhongshi in Beijing.
Great to have you with us. I'm Wang Mengmang.
Chinese President Xi Jinping says he looks forward to having an in-depth exchange with Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva to enhance relations, promote the synergy of both countries' development strategies, and discuss international and regional issues of common interest. Xi made the remarks in a written statement after his arrival in Brazil for the G20 Summit and a state visit. President Xi highlighted the strong partnership between China and Brazil, noting their deep political trust, fruitful cooperation, and growing cultural exchanges under his and President Lula's leadership. He said both nations, as major developing countries from different hemispheres, have worked together to amplify the voice of the Global South and contribute to world peace and development. 2024 marks the 50th anniversary of diplomatic ties between the two countries. President Xi emphasized that their relations are at a historic juncture. He expressed his hopes to strengthen their strategic alignment and cooperation, ushering in a new golden 50 years. President Xi said he looks forward to the G20 Summit as a chance to collaborate with global leaders to advance multipolarity, inclusive globalization, and the G20's role as a key platform for international economic cooperation.
Well, this year's G20 Summit is focused on building a just world and a sustainable planet. Our correspondent Paulo Cabral reports from Rio de Janeiro.
Well, it's a very important meeting. We are here at the venue. Let me just show you right behind me, if you see that blue structure there with G20 written on it, that's where the leaders will be coming through to get to the venue of the summit itself, and much anticipation for the arrival of all the delegations. Some of them have already arrived, just like the Chinese and President Xi Jinping. Others still coming to Rio de Janeiro. And Brazil, as the president of the G20 this year, has actually established three main access for discussion. That's what's going to happen here in the venue in Rio de Janeiro. The first one is social justice and the fight against inequality. Brazil has even launched a global alliance against hunger and against poverty. And another thing, as we're saying now, is the sustainable development and transition to clean energy is the second axis of discussion here. Another aspect, another issue where Brazil has a very strong action. And finally, the third axis proposed by Brazil is the discussion on the reform of global governance. While it's certainly very significant, there was much anticipation here in Brazil for the state visit of President Xi Jinping. As you know, China is Brazil's main commercial partner. Most of Brazilian exports, about 70% of Brazilian soy, for example, which is Brazil's main export product, now go to China, which is also the main buyer of Brazilian iron ore and several other mineral and agricultural commodities. So there is that, very important because of the commercial aspect, but then there is politics as well. Both Brazil and China are strong proponents of multilateralism and also of an alliance between the developing countries of what's being called now the Global South. So there is much anticipation for this visit of Xi Jinping here in Brazil, again, for mainly these two reasons. For a more pragmatic point of view, trade with China is essential for Brazil, and Brazil wants to increase it. And if you take a broader approach in terms of world politics, Brazil and China tend to be allies in this idea of fostering relations and working together with the countries of the Global South, the developing countries of the world.
And the African Union is attending this year's G20 Summit for the very first time as the permanent member. Let's now hand over to my colleague Hannah Viviers in Nairobi for an African perspective on this.
Well, Africa's current push for fairness and global economic governance falls right within this year's G20 theme of building a just world and a sustainable planet. The inclusion of the African Union in the G20 therefore offers a greater opportunity to advance Africa's agenda. Let's take a look at this with my colleague Daniel Arab Moy joining us from right here in Nairobi. Hi there, Daniel. Good to see you. Daniel, the AU became a permanent member of the G20 last September. What are the AU's biggest priorities at this summit?
The African Union has come up with 6 key priority areas that will be of focus at the G20 Summit this year. And the first one is advocating for energy transition. Now, despite, of course, Africa having substantial potential for renewable energy, the continent has lagged behind others in the energy transition process. Of course, according to the International Monetary Fund, Africa has been receiving less than 2% of global investment in renewable energy over the past 2 decades. Now, the G20 Summit would be an ideal platform, if I might say, to mobilize further support and the resources needed to help Africa accelerate its transition in terms of energy. And then we're also looking at the agricultural sector, the output of agriculture. And of course, we know that that agriculture contributes approximately 35% of Africa's gross domestic product and employs roughly half of its working population, therefore presenting substantial potential for the continent's growth. But despite this potential, we still see Africa relying on scarce foreign exchange resources to import about $50 billion worth of food products annually, now leaving the continent vulnerable to global food prices and fluctuations. Now, Africa's experience, of course, and plan of action to address this issue is expected to be one of the key focus areas in the G20 Summit. Now, more pressing, of course, for Africa is the need to address the inequitable allocation of international financial assistance. African countries, as we all know, have historically received far less borrowing from the International Monetary Fund in terms of volumes. Now, further discussions at the G20 is an opportunity for the continent of Africa. And actually, earlier on, my colleague Enoch Sikoli had an interaction with Professor Macharia Munene, an international relations expert, on what Africa's admission into the G20 means in terms of its market size and the challenges that lie ahead. Let's take a quick listen.
Until September 2023, South Africa was the only African country represented within the G20. But in a groundbreaking decision at the G20 Summit in Delhi, India, the AU was granted permanent membership, elevating the continent of 55 countries to a status alongside the European Union and 19 of the world's leading economies. This move marked a historic turning point that recognized the vast potential of a continent brimming with opportunity.
Things are decided there, you want to be part of the decision making. So you join a club because it appears to be making decisions that might affect you. So in theory, you are there to safeguard your interest. Whether you manage to do it or not is another matter.
Africa represents 20% of the world's territory and is home to a young, dynamic population that promises to shape the future global workforce.
It's projected that the African market is going to be very big. So there is a lot of fighting to tap the African market. The problem with the African market, it is a consumer market.
The AU's entry into the G20 is more than symbolic. With a combined GDP of over $3 trillion, the continent holds 60% of the world's renewable energy assets and 50% of the minerals needed for low carbon technologies, making Africa a future powerhouse in the transition to a sustainable economy. Now, as a permanent member of the G20, the AU faces new challenges, chief among them unifying the agendas of its diverse members to effectively influence global decision-making. Experts say the AU can offer fresh perspectives to the global economic agenda, especially in areas like inequality, hunger, and poverty, issues that resonate with developing nations.
Needs to reshape its thinking and overhaul in thinking in order to be able to identify proper African interests that can be projected and argued forcefully in a forum like the G20 or even the United Nations and other places.
The world will be watching to see and hear how Africa has positioned itself to tap into the opportunities the global economic stage throws its way. Enoch Sikoli, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Well, we now have with us Professor Francis Onditi, Head of School for International Relations and Diplomacy at the Riara University in Nairobi, Kenya. Hi there, Professor. Thank you so much for joining us. How does the inclusion of the AU in the G20, Professor, benefit Africa and the global South as a whole?
I would want us to appreciate the fact that the G20 as a club is what you can call a watershed of global governance. It is a watershed, because of many things. But one of the things that is important that resonate very well with African Rising is that it is a platform that produces 85% of the global economic output. In fact, 75% of the exports globally are actually originating from the 18 countries. And of course, the 75%, 80% of world's population is actually originating from the membership of the G20. And so it provides and, gives an opportunity to African Union to position itself, not just as a consumer, as my colleague, Professor Monene said, but also as a producer, a key player in all this. And the more African states become even direct members, the more they become useful to the G20. The only challenge is that up to 2023 is only South Africa that is a direct member. Having AU as an institution it does not really guarantee effective membership or effective and productive contribution of African states. In my view, if you ask me, I think we must go the South African way of each member or African member states joining the G20 as individual states as opposed to institutional approach as it is now.
So, Professor, Africa has got many and various pressing issues at the moment. What do you think the AU should prioritize or focus on at this G20 summit?
In 2020, I think the G20 introduced what they call the common framework for the treatment of debts. Now, this is one of the opportunities that African states can thrive on because many of the African states are highly indebted. And so by them joining the common framework of treatment of the indebtedness, it means that African states can be able to service their debts effectively without burdening the population. But secondly, they can be able to get debt reliefs. So if the African states are to position themselves within the G20, I think that would be one of the areas that I foresee. Of course, we cannot, put under the carpet important issues such as climate change, which the G20 also puts on the table.
Professor Onditi, Head of School for the International Relations and Diplomacy at the Riara University right here in Nairobi, Kenya. Well, after this year's summit, Africa will still be in focus because South Africa is gearing up to host the G20 in 2025. Over to you.
Thanks so much for that part. Now, Peru has recently declared February 1st as China-Peru Friendship Day, celebrating nearly 2 centuries of shared history. Now, this growing partnership is reflected in projects like the China-funded Chancay port near Lima, which promises to cut shipping times and boost tourism by highlighting the region's rich heritage. Our reporter Huang Fei spoke with Peru's Vice Minister of Tourism to find out more.
Madeline, thank you for meeting me here in this beautiful Chinese park.
Well, for us it's very important. It's a new tourist resources. are made for the Chinese community here in Peru, and remind us how long the Chinese people is in Peru, helping to develop our economy, of course.
Yeah, you said we had 160 years of history, migration.
More than 184 years.
84, wow, 184 years.
Now we have a big new Inca Trail, which is Chancay to Shanghai.
I was so surprised to read that the Chancay project also involved sustainability initiatives, protecting the birds, the wildlife there.
Well, we are really surprised when we visit Chancay port. Everything is technology in that port, but what is very important, we are really care about the environmental issues, inclusion issues. Even we are working together for a new tourism plan for Chancay port, because as I know, a lot of people will visit Chancay, and very near to Lima, but also we have a wonderful gastronomy and a special place like Caral. Caral has more than 5,000 years before Christ, so it's very ancient. So it's the first city in the world created for commercial things, not for a war, not for protected, just for commercial market. So it is very important. Chancay port also will increase the movement between China and Peru, and we are looking for more tourism. We notice the investment of China in Peru is growing, so even in the schools, the young people is interested to learn Mandarin, because Peru has a very open economy. We sign agreements with 122 countries, and we are open to the world economy. So this is a new way, as the President of China, Xi said, this is a new global way to exchange our customs, our goods, to make friendship with all the countries.
South Korea has been selected to host the 2025 APEC meetings in the city of Jeonju. The country hopes to enhance economic growth, showcase cultural achievements, demonstrate environmental leadership, and boost its regional and global diplomacy through the event. CGTN's Jack Barton has more from Seoul.
South Korea is a founding member of APEC, but it's been 20 years since the last Leaders' Summit was held here. The Foreign Ministry says the theme of next year's gathering will be Building a Sustainable Tomorrow, Connect, Innovate, Prosper. To achieve those lofty goals, the Foreign Ministry says the forum will focus heavily on trade and investment, innovation and digitalization, as well as sustainable and inclusive growth. Trade will be a top priority for Seoul. APEC members represent about 60% of global GDP and over 50% of world trade. South Korea hopes hosting APEC will boost its status as a hub for trade and economic cooperation and lead to greater foreign investment. The event is also viewed here as an opportunity to showcase efforts aimed at a carbon-neutral future, cultural achievements, and a chance to strengthen international relationships and foster long-term strategic partnerships. All of this at a time when the country is trying to expand its global role in diplomacy, technology, and sustainability. Jack Barton, CGTN, Seoul.
The G20 Summit in Rio pursues an agenda for a fairer world, a more sustainable planet, focused on the needs of developing economies by accelerating efforts to reduce emissions, increasing access to affordable clean energy and climate financing. Join us on CGTN for our special coverage of the meetings of the G20.
Voters across Senegal have cast their ballots in parliamentary elections, with the first provisional results expected by Monday. More than 7 million registered voters had the chance to elect candidates for the country's 165-seat assembly. The ruling PASTEF party, led by President Bassirou Diomaye Faye and Prime Minister Ousmane Sonko, is projected to win. Faye is hoping for a clear parliamentary majority to implement his promised reforms. The president's main rivals are from an unexpected alliance of two opposition parties, including the Republic Party headed by former President Macky Sall. Faye secured victory in the March presidential elections with pledges for economic transformation, social justice, and an end to corruption.
We came to vote so that we can have change. This is a change that everyone has been waiting for today. We therefore hope that the new members of parliament will make a difference.
I am very happy to have voted. Women must participate in the development of the country, and that is why I got up early this morning to come and vote. I hope that women are sufficiently represented in the National Assembly because there are very few of them in the hemicycle.
We want the country to get back on track. The new assembly must enable the people to resume the normal course of life. We hope that the MPs will work to bring down the cost of living.
Lebanese authorities say Israel has intensified its attacks across the country. Hezbollah has confirmed its media relations chief, Mohammed Afif, was killed in an Israeli strike on central Beirut on Sunday. Local TV channel Al Jadid also reported that an Israeli airstrike targeted Hezbollah's head of operations on the southern front, Mahmoud Mahdi, but his fate remains unknown. Meanwhile, there have been reports that there are moves to achieve a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, but no concrete progress has been reported. Jonathan Rangiff has more in Tel Aviv.
As far as Lebanon is concerned, negotiations parallel with heavy bombardments, are the two things connected? Probably yes. There is a feeling in Israel that the ceasefire may be coming soon. Not tomorrow, not the day after, but it might be happening in the next few weeks. And therefore, many Israeli officials, the Israeli army, believe that whatever will not be achieved now in the coming days, in the coming weeks, will not eventually be achieved because the war will be stopped with some kind of an agreement. That is why we're seeing intense bombardment of especially the Dahya neighborhood in Beirut, but not only the Dahya neighborhood. This high-ranking Hezbollah official today was killed in the Lebanese area, but in another neighborhood, we're also seeing the ground offensive progressing in southern Lebanon. There is a feeling in Israel that some kind of an agreement will be reached soon, and therefore Israel has to move quickly to achieve as many of its goals as it can. There are also reports in Lebanon that Amos Hochstein, the American envoy, might be coming to the region, to Lebanon, in the coming days. Therefore, there is a parallel between these heavy bombardments and the negotiations for a ceasefire, as Israel believes that whatever will not be achieved now will not be achieved at all, and that is why it has to act fast.
Jonathan Reggitt for us there. Now, an Israeli airstrike has killed 30 people in Beit Lahia in northern Gaza. Rescue teams are reportedly unable to access some areas, and many people are still trapped under the rubble. Rami Almagari has the details from Gaza.
Civil Defense Service is unable to reach those areas, to reach out them and to help them, or to save, or to secure them. Actually, the situation is getting tense over the last hours after Israel has seemingly, or the Israeli army has seemingly sent out a last ultimatum for the residents of the Beit Lahia town, the Mashru Beit Lahia, telling them to leave immediately by 2:30 p.m. That is actually the situation here is getting tense, and the access for the medical crews, the civil defense crews, is difficult, with the death toll is increasing over that area. Today, the day dawn, there was the largest strike in the past 40 days, and other strikes hit the other two parts of the northern Gaza Strip. The Al-Auda hospital, which is the only operating, mainly operating in the northern northern parts of the Gaza Strip, said that it is only running major operations, and it is running out of fuel needed to generate electricity inside the hospital. The situation is critical these times, as I said, with an ultimatum seemingly by the Israeli army for the residents of Beit Lahia to leave immediately, as the Israeli army's actions continue unabated, with more houses being reportedly destroyed or detonated over there. Other developments, actually, if that is the situation for the northern parts of the Gaza Strip.
In the Philippines, officials say at least 8 people have been killed by super typhoon Man-yi. Man-yi swept across the main island of Luzon on Sunday with heavy rain and strong winds. Authorities say it will take months to restore power to an island that bore the brunt of first landfall. We get this report from CGTN's Ray Addison.
Islands battered by waves and wind, homes under threat, and more than 1 million people forced to flee to emergency shelters due to the deadly effects of super typhoon Man-yi.
We evacuated because every time there is a typhoon, the water rises in the nearby river. We have children with us and we are scared. That is why we evacuated.
With powerful winds reaching 185 kilometers per hour and waves of 44 meters, Man-yi, known locally as Pepito, has splintered homes, schools and businesses, uprooted trees and brought down power lines. And it's the 6th tropical cyclone to hit the Philippines in a month. In October, Tropical Storm Trami and Typhoon Kongray brought heavy flooding, triggered landslides and killed more than 160 people. The damage to communities, infrastructure and farmlands has been extensive. Although meteorologists say Man-yi is expected to weaken slightly, they're still urging people to take precautionary measures and warn it still poses a potentially dangerous and life-threatening situation. Ray Addison, CGTN.
After 3 years, China's ocean drilling vessel Mengxiang is ready for its deep-sea mission, marking a new milestone in China's underwater explorations. Huang Yichang has this report.
On Sunday, during the official commission of the vessel Mengxiang, Chinese President Xi Jinping sent a congratulatory letter celebrating the delivery of the country's first domestically grown deep ocean drilling vessel. With its striking design, gleaming white on the top and vibrant orange-red below, what truly sets the ship apart is the huge equipment it carries.
Behind me, towering over the ship, is where the magic happens. A massive drilling rig capable of reaching over 11,000 meters beneath the sea.
With its world-leading drilling capacity, the vessel is expected to help scientists worldwide to drill through Earth's crust and unlock the mysteries of the ocean floor. But Mengxiang is more than just a drilling ship, it's also a floating hub of innovation.
Beneath the deck, there are 9 scientific laboratories.
On-board facilities allow scientists to analyze fresh samples in real time.
The rock cores extracted from the seafloor are around 10 meters long. They are then sent from the drilling platform to the transfer machine, where they are segmented into 1.5 meter sections.
Yes,
that's correct.
In one of the geology laboratories, segmented rock core samples are neatly arranged, waiting to be analyzed.
Scientists extract different types of samples based on specific research objectives, then send them to specified laboratories for analysis and testing.
Spanning over 3,000 square meters, the laboratory area is equipped with world-class technology and instruments to meet all marine scientific research needs. The vessel is capable of traveling up to 15,000 nautical miles and operating continuously for up to 120 days.
The fireworks light up the sky. Mengxiang is ready to set sail and take China's deep-sea exploration to new depths.
And fulfill President Xi Jinping's call in his congratulatory letter to fully use this major scientific apparatus to strengthen marine innovation and expand international ocean cooperation. Huang Yichang, CGTN, Guangzhou.
The G20 Summit in Rio. pursues an agenda for a fairer world, a more sustainable planet, focused on the needs of developing economies by accelerating efforts to reduce emissions, increasing access to affordable clean energy and climate financing. Join us on CGTN for our special coverage of the meetings of the G20.
You might think you are better informed in an information age. The fact is, people are more often misled by misinformation. You might think every voice is heard in a digital world. The fact is, many nations and peoples are still underrepresented. And data poverty shuts out many. We at CGTN are committed to transcending the information gap and the digital divide. CGTN, bridging nations and civilizations. CGTN, see the difference.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN, see the difference.
Welcome to our special coverage of the 2024 G20 Summit. I'm Zhongshi in Beijing.
And I'm Wang Mengmang. This year's G20 Summit begins today in the city of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, which currently holds the group's rotating presidency. Leaders of the bloc are set to discuss the future of global governance under the theme Building a Just World and a Sustainable Planet.
There are three main topics in the summit's agenda: social inclusion, the reform of international institutions, and energy transitions. We'll bring you live coverage of the event. Make sure you stay with us right here on CGTN.
Right now, let's check in the latest with our reporter Chen Ziyuan. She's live for us now from Rio. Wow, Ziyuan, good to see you there. So at this gathering, leaders will spend Monday and Tuesday discussing a whole range of issues concerning our world today. And, the G20 comes right off the heels of the APEC meeting. Tell us what the atmosphere is like where you are in Rio.
Well, it has been very busy here in the morning. All the cameras are up and the media are really anxiously waiting to see what are the discussions all about. So let me brief you with the latest update here. So the world leaders are arriving at the venue. The major event is going to be kicked off very soon. And we heard that the Brazilian President Lula will be delivering a speech. And the first topic that we'll be focusing on this morning is the launching of the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty. This will be on topics discussion against alleviation of poverty, and also I believe as President Xi Jinping will be delivering a speech, he will be touching on China's experience and China's wisdom and contribution to the world's efforts in fighting against poverty. And later in the afternoon, we will also be hearing discussions on global governance reform. So these are the discussions that are among the media, and also people are waiting to see what are the outcomes of the discussion. Back to you in the studio, Mama.
Ziyuan, China's participation obviously in the spotlight again for a number of reasons. As a key member of the Global South and a strong advocate for an elevated position of the Global South collectively, tell us more about what China intends to say at this summit.
Well, as I just mentioned previously, one of the major topics that will be discussed upon is the efforts of fighting against poverty and hunger. So that's the perspective that China can contribute its wisdom to. In addition to that, in the afternoon is focusing on global governance reform. And as we know that the African Union is participating as a full member this year at the G20 Summit. So the voice of the Global South countries are expanding. We're seeing the increasing voices of the Global South countries here. So as I talked to the Minister of Institutional Affairs representing Brazil, he said that not only they're looking for G20, but they're also looking for President Xi's state visit to the country as events continue to unfold. So China has a really strong presence here. First of all, sharing its wisdom of fighting against poverty here at the occasion. In addition to that, sharing its wisdom and also representation of the Global South countries' voices here at the international stage. It's just because we know that G20 was a Western domination of international mechanism, and with the presence of Global South countries here, more issues will be discussed, especially based on the interests of the developing countries. That's all I have for now. Back to in studio, Zhongshi.
Well, thank you so much, Yuan, for that update. And now let's also talk to our correspondent, Paulo Cabral. He's also at the G20 Summit. He's following this very closely from the Media Center. Paulo, a lot of topics on the agenda, from hunger to poverty, the climate, and of course, the reform of global institutions. How can we expect leaders of the group of 20 nations to approach and address these issues?
Well, we're going to be watching it closely from here, the International Media Center. And let's just quickly show you what this is about. This is the Media Center with hundreds of journalists working here. You can see lots of people with cameras and their lives. And we'll be watching all the speeches, or the ones that will be made available on this big screen that you see right behind me. Much expectation of all the media here. And well, since the United States President Biden is now an outgoing president, and the Russian President Vladimir Putin will not be coming, there is of course much interest and much anticipation for the participation of Chinese President Xi Jinping, who's already in Rio de Janeiro. We have not seen him entering here the venue yet on this big screen behind us. We've seen other world leaders already coming in, but yes, much expectation as to what President Xi Jinping will bring here to this venue of the G20. As you know, Brazil is presiding G20 this year, and there are three main axes that Brazil has brought to the table, which are, as you were just saying, the fight against poverty and inequality. Actually, President Lula is launching officially the Global Alliance Against Poverty and Inequality, against hunger, this morning here in Rio de Janeiro. And then in the afternoon, it's more likely to go on discussions on the second axis of this G20, which is the reform of global governance. And then there is also a third axis that has to do with sustainable development and transition to clean energy in the world. And this is what's likely to dominate this 2 days of G20 Summit here in Rio.
Paulo, it's truly a packed room where you are, an international event that gathers international press and media. In your interactions with fellow reporters and journalists, what is the focus of their reporting? What do they say their expectations are for this summit?
Well, look, there is, you know, that the world is in a moment when there is much questioning about multilateralism, with the conflicts that have been happening, with the difficulties of countries getting together and agreeing on things during this the trying periods that we have been going through the world. So I would say that one of the things that people want really to look here in the summit is how much these leaders that are coming together here will be able to achieve consensus, will be able to achieve agreements to deal with issues that actually concern the whole world. Again, we are discussing here poverty, inequality, clean energy, sustainability, climate change, global governance. This has to do with the whole world. Everybody has a stake on that. So I would say that the big thing here is to really try and understand how much these countries will be able to advance in a multilateral agenda.
Paulo, we appreciate your reporting. We hope to check back in with you throughout this summit. Thank you so much.
The 2 days of the G20 Summit come at a crucial time in global politics. CGTN's Dan Williams has the latest from Rio de Janeiro.
The G20 that brings together 19 countries as well as the European and African unions begins here in Rio de Janeiro against a backdrop of global pressures. But Brazil, as host, is determined to ensure that this summit delivers meaningful outcomes. World leaders arrive in Brazil with seemingly different approaches to address various global issues, and there is plenty to go at. Not least the continuing global conflicts and the concerns over the future of the global economy. At this G20, Brazil is determined to also focus on the climate crisis and growing inequalities. Those issues are reflected in the summit theme of building a just world. The agenda also includes the launch of the first ever Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, which aims to accelerate efforts in the fight against hunger and poverty by 2030. Global governance reform will also come into focus with an aim to modernize principal international institutions such as the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund and the World Trade Organization. The aim is to promote fairer and more efficient governance, while the climate crisis will also be addressed. On Tuesday, the debates will focus on energy transitions, discussing strategies to promote a more sustainable global economy. But of course, there is also no escaping the other element here, the potential changes that may soon come following the re-election of Donald Trump as US President. Security, as always, is extremely tight, but measures were tightened further following the failed bomb attack outside Brazil's Supreme Court in Brasilia last week. Dan Williams, CGTN, Rio de Janeiro.
For more insight, we're joined by a great panel in our program today. We have Professor Wang Xinsong with the School of Government at Beijing Normal University and Andy Mok, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Gentlemen, fantastic to have both of you on our special program today. Professor Wang, let me start with you. The theme of this year's G20 revolves around building a fair and sustainable world. What do you make of the reasons behind this theme, and how should world leaders approach and tackle these issues?
Right. I think what we are seeing today in the world is full of issues. For example, we are having two wars going on. We're having populism and right-oriented movement in many countries in the world. We have climate change that has imposed a lot of tolls on all the countries in the world. And we have countries who support unilateralism and protectionism that's not good for the health of the global economy. So overall, we are facing a lot of issues that need more coordination through a global governance system. I think the G20 is a very helpful platform for which the global leaders can sit down and really get into those issues. Although obviously we are also having some difficulties within the G20 platform. For example, you have developed countries and countries from the global south who have different opinions on issues related to climate change and so on and so forth. But again, this communication really matters for people to express their voices at the same time, to hear each other.
Well, this year's G20 built on the success of the previous G20 summits. In 2022, it was Indonesia, and last year it was in New Delhi, India. And of course, each G20 faces its unique conditions, difficulties, but this time President Lula is really trying to put the voices of developing nations front and center of the G20 presidency in Brazil. What are your expectations now from hearing more from the global south? Because after all, this is the third consecutive year that a major country from the global south is hosting this event. Next year it will be in South Africa. So your thoughts on this?
Well, I think my expectations for this G20 is greater momentum, greater solidarity for all countries in the world. So we heard that the African Union for the first time is participating after becoming a permanent member. And I think what this shows is that the world is moving towards a much more inclusive vision of how to move towards a more sustainable future versus one based on exclusion. So I think this is very, very important. We could probably call this vibes, but even though it sounds a bit intangible, I think it's very, very important. I think the other thing I'm paying attention to is the role that China has played, as we can think of it as almost as the glue being the consistent voice for working together for inclusiveness, for win-win outcomes. And certainly when it comes to poverty alleviation, addressing hunger, China, of course, has wisdom to share, but I think also hard-won practical insights for having confronted and overcome these challenges itself within living memory.
All right, guys, appreciate your perspectives. Do stay with us here. Thank you so much. And what began as a forum on the ministerial level for finance has expanded into a platform for heads of state of major developed and developing countries to address international issues. Let's now take a look at how the G20 evolved.
The G20, standing for the Group of 20, has 19 member countries, including the US, China, and Brazil, and 2 regional bodies, the European Union and the African Union. G20 members represent around 85% of the world's GDP, 80% of global trade, and around 2/3 of the world's population. The group was founded in 1999 after the Asian financial crisis. It initially served as a forum for finance ministers and central bank governors to discuss global economic and financial issues. It was later upgraded to the heads of state level following the global economic and financial crisis, which began in 2007. In 2008, the first G20 Leaders Summit took place in Washington, D.C. Under a rotating presidency, the forum has expanded from a purely economic focus to a wider mandate covering virtually every aspect on the international stage, including sustainable development, healthcare, energy cooperation, and anti-corruption. Since the inaugural G20 Summit, China has attached great importance to G20 cooperation and contributed ideas and solutions in the pursuit of efficient global economic governance and sustainable development. Addressing the annual summits over the past decade, Chinese President Xi Jinping has highlighted the importance of partnership, common development, sustainable growth, and openness. He has also regularly emphasized the need for concerted efforts in building a community with a shared future for mankind.
And now let's hear some more analysis from our guests here in the studio. Well, I really want to bring up the issue of climate change because it's pretty remarkable to see how 2 concurrent events, the G20 and the COP29, the climate talks, UN climate talks that's taking place in Baku, Azerbaijan, those talks are stalled. There's an impasse over funding, who should pay the bill. I mean, developing and developed nations are always divided over this issue. So they're pinning their hopes now on the G20 leaders in Rio de Janeiro. Do you think that's some attainable goal to have the G20 leaders make a compromise or a promise in this regard, Andy?
Well, I think one certainly can hope for this, but again, I think this is a thorny, perhaps even intractable might be too strong a word, but certainly one can hope for breakthroughs, and we have to see what happens. But I think what's very important to point out, where everyone can agree, is the role of technology in climate change, because that can not only deliver better solutions, but more cost-effective solutions as well. And of course, we know when we can lower the cost of offering any product, any service, that makes it more accessible, whether you're a developed country, a developing country. So certainly we can hope for breakthroughs, but I would also look at what's going on in the technology front.
Professor Wang, let me ask you about the role Brazil plays here. As the host nation, it of course has it's put forward its own ideas of what takes priority at this summit, and that's ending hunger, reducing poverty, sustainability, and of course reforming international financial institutions so that the global South as a community can have a bigger and stronger voice internationally. Why do these things matter, particularly for Brazil?
Well, overall, I think this matter really is important for the global development. And over the past 7 decades, the world has spent $5 trillion just to eradicate poverty, but we still have a lot of issues with global inequality. And speaking of that, the latest statistics shows that 58% of the global income goes to the top 10% income earners, whereas the bottom 50% of the world's income earners only get 8% of the income. So you see a huge gap between the haves and have-nots. And on that regard, the Brazilian government has really made some tremendous efforts in eradicating poverty, but also hunger problem. And they have been running this program of hunger reduction program for a few years. And we have seen that with the help of the World Bank and other international institutions, as well as fiscal support from the Brazilian government, the hunger rate has greatly been downsized as a result of those programs. So it shows that programs like cash transfer can be really, really helpful. And that program has now been spread to other developing countries as well. But plus, you have many other means that can really help countries to get out of the poverty trap. I think China, like Professor Mark just mentioned, has set a very good example for the rest of the world in terms of poverty reduction through development and through a strong capacity of the state that can really mobilize resources and distribute it in a very meaningful way. But overall, I think the point made by the Brazilian government to emphasize on the issue of hunger really tells the world that we're not there yet. We're still having a very serious problem that needs the attention from the global leaders.
What's really getting in the way when it comes to poverty and hunger reduction? Is it a matter of funding, or is it about the allocation of funding, the implementation of policies, or capacity building?
Well, I think it's all of those, Mong Mong. But when we look at Brazil, we look at Latin America and Africa, I think we can't overlook the legacy of colonialization. Because we look at the pattern of infrastructure investment in South America, it's largely along the coastal regions. And that's because in the days of the conquistadors, in the days of colonization, these regions were used purely for resource extraction. And what this meant was that, of course, the local population was ignored in terms of education, healthcare, and I think that still has a lingering impact. But what we see also is a severe lack of infrastructure linking the interior parts of the continent of both South America and Africa. So this is where I think China never has been colonized and so has avoided this problem, but at the same time also has contributed to global infrastructure development. So we, of course, have heard about the Chancay port over the last few days. That's not only good for Peru, but it is actually also a catalyst for regional interior infrastructure development, such as highways and railways, particularly in Brazil, to link to the port in Peru. So I think this is a very, very important factor that gives me hope. And I think we can see a brighter future both in South America and Africa as a result of increasing investments in infrastructure, as well as some of the other things that Professor Wong talked about, fiscal transfers, better policy, better coordination, transparency, et cetera. But I would also emphasize infrastructure.
Professor Wong, just to follow up on that, because we're expecting to hear an announcement of a global alliance against hunger and poverty being established at the summit this time. It is our understanding that many countries have signed up to join this alliance, global alliance. What does it mean for the coordination of individual countries' efforts to fight poverty and hunger? What could this alliance possibly do?
Well, I think a number of things. The fact that this alliance has been raised and established through the G20 platform speaks about the importance of the issue, but also a potential pool of resources where individual countries can tap into. So, for example, there might be a mechanism in collaboration with the World Bank to create a fiscal fund so that individual countries can establish programs like what we already have in Brazil to support the hunger reduction problem in the individual countries. But also the fact that many developing countries in the global south are part of the G20 platform. For example, 55 new nations have joined G20 through the African Union. Also tells us, countries can exchange development experience with each other through such a platform. So earlier we talked about the Chinese development experience and poverty reduction. A big chunk of the poverty reduction in the world in the past 4 decades has come from China, where 800 million people were out of poverty. So China has some development experience that can be shared with other developing countries, just like the Brazilian programs is telling other countries that if we can do it, everybody can sort of also learn from each other and do a better job in hunger reduction.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much. Ahead of the 2024 G20 Summit, Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva has sat down for an exclusive interview with our colleague Wang Guan. President Lula shares the key topics on the agenda, expressing optimism that the summit will be both productive and amicable.
Let's talk about the upcoming G20. President Lula, that is a very big thing on the agenda of your presidency. What are the top priorities of the upcoming G20 in Rio? How will this summit help resolve pressing global issues? For example, aligning the agenda of the summit with the needs of developing countries and the global south.
Nós primeiros estamos lançando a Aliança Global contra a Fome e a Pobreza, que é uma coisa que eu acho extraordinária e não é apenas para os países do G20, é para todos os países do mundo. Depois nós estamos discutindo muito a questão da transição energética e a questão climática, porque já está provado que não tem espaço para o ser humano viver fora do planeta Terra. Então, ao invés de ficar procurando outro planeta, nós temos que tentar fazer com que o planeta Terra tenha uma qualidade de água, uma qualidade de ar, para que a gente possa viver dignamente e decentemente. Depois a gente quer rediscutir o sistema de Bretton Woods, ou seja, o papel dos bancos financeiros como FMI e Banco Mundial, que hoje eles não são utilizados para favorecer os países em desenvolvimento que precisam de financiamento. São bancos utilizados para sufocar os países pobres. Hoje a África tem uma dívida de 900 bilhões de dólares. O que eles pagam de juro é mais do que eles têm capacidade de investimento no desenvolvimento. E eu estou defendendo uma ideia de que parte dessa dívida que os países africanos têm com o FMI seja transformada em investimentos em infraestrutura na África. E vamos ter, pela primeira vez, a gente vai ter uma coisa chamada, empoderamento feminino, fazendo com que as mulheres possam efetivamente participar de forma igualitária nas coisas políticas que o mundo decide. Então eu estou muito otimista que vai ser um G20 muito produtivo, muito cordial e vai ser, eu acho que um aprendizado para todos nós. Além do que, muita gente vai conhecer o Rio de Janeiro pela primeira vez e o Rio é uma cidade maravilhosa.
And earlier we spoke to Daniel Ribetti, an assistant professor of accounting and finance at the National University of Singapore, who shared his insight into how finance can be a tool to help reduce poverty.
The Brazilian president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, has already anticipated that combating poverty and financial inclusion is one of the main goals of the G20 Summit happening in Brazil. There's no doubt that finance is crucial in reducing poverty, especially with the emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, blockchain, and decentralized finance. For instance, an AI-driven credit scoring enables microfinance institutions to access creditworthiness even for individuals without formal banking history, extending loans to those previously excluded from the financial banking systems. This access allows low-income communities to invest in education, healthcare, and businesses, breaking the cycle of poverty. Additionally, social impact investing directs private capital towards projects that deliver financial returns and social benefits such as affordable housing or healthcare infrastructure. Public-private partnerships enhance these efforts by combining government funding with private sector efficiency to tackle infrastructure and food security challenges, which is also part of the G20 Summit agenda. Last but not least, development and social bonds provide structured funding for poverty alleviation, targeting specific needs in schools and hospitals, for instance. When strategically applied and enhanced by technologies like artificial intelligence, blockchain, decentralized finance becomes a powerful driver of social change and sustainable development.
And now let's further discuss poverty reduction. And we want to hear from Professor Wang here in the studio that we know that this is one of your area of expertise. You spent quite some time working, researching, and studying in the countryside. What kind of experiences could China offer in terms of poverty reduction to the global South countries? You mentioned just now that China has created miracle in helping, lift more than 800 million people out of poverty. Mm-hmm. How could China contribute in this regard?
Right. I think a number of things that China did right in terms of lifting people out of poverty over the past 4 decades. And one is obviously the vision is very important. I think the Chinese Communist Party has set up a very long-term vision of moving China from a economic backwater to a advanced economy overall. So the idea is that you don't lift people out of poverty just by doing it. You lift people out of poverty by having an overall better economy, more advanced economy that generates income. And then you design policies such as distribution and redistribution of incomes through jobs and through the philanthropy sector. And then, you design other programs more on the ground so that people on the ground can benefit from all kinds of social programs and social policies. So one such social policy is obviously to provide a pension system and insurance system for all the peasants living in rural areas. This started in early 2000s, and now we're talking about nearly 100% of the rural peasants being covered by both medical insurance and pension system. Of course, the payout is still not as much as we would like, but this takes steps considering that we move from a country with not too much of a social safety net to a country now that covers 100% of the people. So yes, the state capacity really important, which is built upon a vision and then followed up by a series of policy. But then, of course, you have very much efforts contributed by the Chinese people who really worked very, very hard under the leadership of the party and the government, in the sense that they have experienced the hardships in during the less developed period. But at the same time, people have this longer vision that if we work hard, we can make it better. So for example, in the 80s and 90s, when the national policy has shifted to encourage rural labor to find urban jobs, we have found that the incomes level of the rural households has increased dramatically as a result of that policy, which then provides them with the income for education. So you break down, you break this, regeneration cycle of lack of education and lack of income by making rural households have more income so that they can invest in human capital of their children, who then are able to get better education and better income jobs. So overall, the positive cycle has been running. I think that is the lesson from the Chinese experience. But of course, not every country can just copy the recipe from the Chinese model or Chinese experience. Every country needs to find its own unique path compatible with their own situation. That's why the Chinese government has always been communicating with our partners in the global South. Number one, we're more than willing to help you with our experience and with some fiscal support. But number two, we really believe in teaching people to fish rather than giving people fish. And at the end of the day, it takes everybody to work on its own for their own best development strategies.
Andy, China's success in fighting poverty speaks for itself, but just like Professor Wang said, it's not all replicable to everywhere else, because poverty as a condition varies from country to country. In Africa, for example, it's due to economic structure, a lack of infrastructure, education for the people, and also the onset of regional conflicts. What part of the China experience or the China model, what part of what Professor Wang just mentioned is more readily to replicate maybe in other regions of the world?
No, I think you're absolutely right, Zhongshi, that one way to understand these poverty issues is they require local solutions that must be adapted to local circumstances. But I can see a couple of areas. So first of all, we think about at the most granular level in terms of productivity. What kind of seeds? How do you plant? How do you irrigate? These are areas that where you have, obviously China has centers of excellence, the agricultural university, et cetera, that has both very cutting edge expertise as well as very practical expertise. I think that can be very useful. I think about incentives, which is incredibly important, as Professor Wang touched on, that without the right incentives, whether that's taxes, subsidies, whatever, at the farmer level, but at the higher level, administrative level, that's the village, that's the county, that's really important. And one term I really like that comes from China is the so-called mayor economy, where many people that are not that familiar with China think of it as top-down, highly centralized, and in a sense that's true. But actually, mayors have to adapt to local circumstances, compete with other mayors to find what works best for their city, their administrative unit. And I think that concept of having the right incentives at the farmer level, at the family level, at the political administrative level, again, it doesn't necessarily have to be China's system, but I think you have to recognize how do you create the right incentives, how do you provide productivity enhancements, again, whether that's seed, fertilizer, irrigation at the farming level, and financing, of course. Sometimes it's as little as we think about it as microfinance. Can a farmer afford a bag of fertilizer that he or she can pay back at the end of the growing season? To can a village afford to buy, rent, lease a tractor? Can you build a grain silo, et cetera? So I think, again, these are all things that China has confronted in China's unique local circumstances, but we can still abstract lessons and insights and strategies that, again, you can take and then relocalize, I think, to a new set of circumstances, whether that's Brazil, whether that's Africa, whether that's India.
And when poverty reduction reaches a certain stage, it will become more difficult. For example, according to China's experience, when the lower hanging fruits have been picked, and the other ones could be more difficult to reach, and it's always the last mile that's tougher. So for global South countries, of course, they're at different levels of development. What are your advice now for those countries, trying to follow China's footsteps to push ahead with their poverty reduction endeavor?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good point that, in fact, the majority of the countries are still trapped in the overall development stage. And for example, 75% of the global population live in the so-called middle-income countries. And since 1990, this is according to the World Bank, since 1990, only 35 countries have been able to overcome the so-called middle-income trap and become the developed countries. And this is based on the threshold of GNI, global national income, per capita GNI of $13,000 on an annual basis. Only 35 countries are able to overcome that barrier. So that speaks a lot about the challenges for the global South countries. Now, what we can do, I think you have emerging market economies who have been doing relatively well in terms of finding out better solutions according to their own local circumstances. But one other thing I'd like to highlight is really to establish a platform through which global South countries can help each other and learn from each other, because At the end of the day, the Western experience, yes, they have been successful, but their lessons are not necessarily so helpful to the situations in the Global South countries. Rather, Global South countries share a lot of commonalities in terms of history, in terms of the circumstances, in terms of the national conditions. So their lessons can really help each other share the experience and find a better solution to their problem. That's why I think the Belt and Road Initiative is really playing a critical role, not only in extending Chinese fiscal support for building infrastructure, but also to establish this network, a network that's not, physical, just like highways and seaports and all that, but network to share experience and to learn from each other.
Andy, can I pick your brain on the role of the Belt and Road Initiative in reducing poverty as well? If I look at this region in particular, Latin America, China is working with Peru on the Chiangkai port. Obviously, that increases connectivity between Latin America and Asia. And in Brazil, we have other projects concerning providing more electricity in the north of the country by building ultra-high voltage power lines. So what have these projects done in contributing to poverty reduction efforts in Latin America?
Well, I think they've been transformational, Zhongshi, because when we think about, and I think for us that we live white-collar, comfortable lives, that we may not appreciate this, but to not have a road, to not have 24-hour electricity, to not have running water, this basic kind of infrastructure can be life-changing and transformational. So I remember I was in Yunnan province, up in the mountains, and meeting with some villagers there. And they said that it used to take them 8 hours to get to the local market. And once a road had been built, and this was not a fancy paved road, it was more or less a gravel road, it took them an hour. And that made many things possible, increase in productivity. It made many activities economically viable. So I think the first phase of the Belt and Road Initiative, which was investing roads, ports, power plants, truly transformational. But we also see that China has adapted, as countries that China's worked with in the Belt and Road Initiative have adapted as well. And there's a greater emphasis now on the renewable side of things. So Brazil, for example, is very, very interested not just in investment, but investment in renewable energy resources. And we see here, of course, China, not only as a leader in technology and the manufacturing of this equipment, but less obviously, but just as importantly, in the project management, in the financing of this. So when we think about wind, large solar, offshore, renewable energy. It's not just the technology and the equipment, it's your ability to plan the project, to implement the project, to finance it. And I think China also, all around the world, is being seen as an incredibly valuable partner.
Yeah. And in our previous discussion, we talked so much about the voices of the Global South, and now we want to mention the AU, the African Union. For the first time in the G20's history, the African Union will take a seat at this year's summit in Brazil as a full member. From achieving financial reforms to equitable energy transition, the African Union is expected to push international partners on pressing issues that need immediate attention. CGTN's Robert Nagila has this report.
Up until last year, South Africa was the only African country that was a permanent member of the G20, an economic bloc that comprised 19 countries and the European Union, boasting about 85% of global GDP and 75% of global trade. But at the 2023 G20 Summit held in India, membership status was granted to the African Union, which represents 55 member states on the continent. Experts say this has given Africa a platform to bring global attention to its priorities, which have taken a back seat with international focus on the conflicts in Gaza and Ukraine.
You're looking at advocating for reform in international financial institutions, enhancing agricultural outputs, achieving a just energy transition, more trade and investment for the African continental free trade area, especially in the rollout.
There are also lingering questions as to whether the G20 will back the African Union's agenda, especially if interests are not aligned.
The problem here is that we're joining the table, but the menu has been set up already for us. We're not deciding, we're not imposing the African priorities. We have to, before going into the G20, define for ourselves what is our economic agenda.
And with 54 countries on the continent, each with its own interests, there are doubts as to whether the AU can adopt a common position for its members on local and global issues.
It's hard to build an agenda based on this kind of consensus when countries are unable to trust who represents them.
Previously, the African Union attended the G20 as an invited international organization. Experts point out that by granting full membership to the AU, the G20 is alive to a growing push for a realignment of the current global order by several countries.
The G20 dominates the world economy and is being gradually challenged by the global majority, which is the global south, with the leadership of BRICS. BRICS is increasingly inviting key players in the global south, especially African countries.
The AU's success at this year's summit, then, may be measured by what commitments to action on its agenda it will receive from the G20. And while there will be a lot of pressure on the AU, there's a feeling out there that the continent's inclusion into this prestigious club could not have come at a better time. Next year, South Africa hosts the G20 Summit. Another core of its agenda is Africa's development. Robert Nagela, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
And my colleague Jiayang spoke with Ramat Allah Muhammad Osman, permanent representative of the African Union to China.
We'll get to that in just a moment, but now we really want to hear more about poverty reduction, for example, and the fight against hunger from our guests here in the studio. There are priorities, of course, each country is working on, but then according to some leaders from the European Union, Ursula von der Leyen, she was saying that we are aiming at, include more countries to join this fight against hunger. Right now, 50 plus more countries are signing on to this endeavor, and they're aiming at 100. Is this a feasible goal to include more countries to be donors and to be helpers in this regard?
I think it certainly is. I mean, one of the good things I think about an issue like global hunger is who can be against it, right? I think it's an issue that everyone can get behind. The question is, how can one contribute? So certainly there are countries that can contribute financial resources. Other countries can contribute technical expertise, maybe in kind, again, seeds, fertilizer, et cetera, that may have a competitive advantage in those kinds of resources. Market access, I think, is another very important asset that can be contributed. And here we see China really has taken a leadership role. So we look at China's relationship with Africa. So not only through formal trade events like the Import-Export Expo, et cetera, but specifically providing expedited bureaucratic processes for African agricultural products to enter the China market. So, I think that, again, the good news is that this is an issue that countries, companies, organizations, individuals all around the world can get behind. But the question is, what's the best way to contribute? I think the other thing to point out, too, is logistics and wastage is a huge, huge issue. And this is an area that doesn't maybe always get enough attention. But again, it's through infrastructure policies that, to the degree you can reduce wastage from the farm to the market, wastage in people eating, perhaps even, that these are all things that can be taken to deliver a more stable and secure food supply to everyone in the world.
Professor Wang, we talked about what part of the Chinese model or the Chinese experience is more replicable. Andy had some great examples. Can you help us take stock of how China is helping in practical terms? For example, poverty festers in rural areas in most countries, and China certainly has been exporting its agricultural expertise in this area. China is training agricultural officials from a lot of African countries, for example. Can you help us summarize in what way is China helping with very practical assistance?
You're right. Yeah, just like what you said, that China has been very instrumental in providing very detailed expertise in terms of agriculture, in terms of public health and other issue areas. And like you said, training is a very big part of it. Actually, personally, I have given talks to the incoming delegations of agricultural officials from Africa from time to time. I've also visited a Chinese agricultural demonstration center in Tanzania, where you have experts coming from China Agriculture University, as well as officials and experts from the Chinese Ministry of Agriculture, staying there for an extended period of time, demonstrating the Chinese agricultural skills and technologies. A lot of issues with agriculture in Africa comes from the susceptibility or vulnerability to weather conditions and also local natural conditions. So you need seeds that are more susceptible to climate impacts on the growth of grains and other crops, but they also need other skills in terms of irrigation, in terms of pesticides, in terms of the periods of time of attending to the needs of all these plants and crops. So all of that really takes hands-on experience and people-to-people exchange. You need experts who stay on the ground and sharing the experience with the local recipients. So that's really helpful. On the public health aspect, and I've also been involved in the Chinese researching on Chinese public health aid to Africa, and I've talked to many experts from the National Health Commission, which has been sending medical teams since 1963 to Africa. The first one was in Algeria, 1963. Every year, China sends many medical teams to African countries, and these teams are comprised of Chinese doctors, nurses, and and experts on public health. And they go to the rural areas of African countries and they provide medical services. They also provide medical training to the local nursing staff and doctors. So this kind of support really helps the African rural residents who usually do not have access to public health services or usual medical services. But now the Chinese doctors are treating thousands and thousands of patients on a yearly basis. So this is very helpful, not only to the local recipient countries, but also for the Chinese side to learn how to best help other countries to accomplish international development through the exchange of experience.
Having said that, though, G20 is, after all, a global platform. It's an institution that involves the major economies in this world. How can the more developed countries, for example, the United States and the EU countries, contribute in this process? Because, according to some officials from developing nations, they say that there's just so much you could count on from the other bloc. Your thoughts on this?
Well, if we think about what the advanced economies are good at, one is, of course, consumption. So there's very high purchasing power. So that certainly is one potential area that I think can be helpful to the global south, especially if we think about agricultural areas moving up the value chain. So, for example, again, I'll go back to when I was in Yunnan. There's an area that grows a kind of like a ginseng type of product called sanqi. And What these farmers did is the government did, not just the farmers, is they not only grew these very high value cash crops, but they then also moved up the value chain by turning it into a kind of a liquor that you could sell. And so on a per ounce basis, it was much more valuable. And again, if you then could sell that to a developed market, the US or Western Europe, now that's certainly very positive. The other thing that advanced economies are good at is financial services, well-developed capital markets, things like that. And to the degree that these kinds of solutions can match more basic agricultural development, poverty alleviation, certainly I think this is very, very valuable. And we see this all around the world, right? That say US capital markets are very, very attractive, not just for large corporations, but other entities that need capital. So I think this is one. And of course, we shouldn't rule out the cutting edge biotech. Professor Long talked about many parts of the world, if you could have seeds that grow in droughts or highly acidic, highly alkali soil, this is a good thing. And of course, China's invested tremendous resources, but other parts of the world also have leading research institutions in biotech that certainly I think can contribute.
I think this is a great point, Professor Wang. How do you get developed countries on board as well? How do they get them on the same page here? Because we're seeing this global alliance to end poverty and hunger. When we talk about global South countries helping each other, it's because it's a very relatable problem. It's festering in their countries. But how do you make sure that we're hoping that, of course, developed countries are signing up for this global alliance as well, not just developing countries, but how do you incentivize developed economies so that they can have a bigger role in this global fight against hunger and poverty?
Yeah, I mean, I think to be sure, we cannot deny the fact that the developed countries have contributed quite a lot since the end of the Second World War to the development in Africa and other parts of the global South, and sometimes bilaterally, but oftentimes through the multilateral institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. And so these institutions and some of the development countries' governments have done quite a lot to initiate programs in terms of poverty eradication and hunger reduction and so on and so forth. However, the problem is that we haven't really seen dramatic changes so far. So there are many development economists who are trying to debate on what went wrong, what can be done better. I think a lot of experts are eyeing on the China experience because China did accomplish quite a lot in poverty reduction. But at the same time, speaking of this alliance of reducing hunger and poverty, it does need everybody to be on board. This is not a game. This is not an enterprise just for global South. So the developed countries really need to work with developing countries and hear their voices and really understand their real concerns. Why this matters to them? Well, I think the top concern is obviously poverty can spill over. When countries get into poverty, poverty can turn into a lot of other issues, including civil strife, if not civil wars, which can then spill over to neighboring countries, which can end up having floods and floods of refugees. We've seen the Syrian crisis since 2015 that has generated a lot of refugees coming to Europe, then creating new social problems for the European countries. So the point is that developed countries are very much connected with the issues in global South. In this world, nobody can be exempted from global issues like hunger and poverty.
Both of you mentioned seeds just now, how they're crucial in agriculture and the susceptibility to weather impact is also an important issue facing farmers around the world. But I also want to mention climate change because the countries and the communities that are at the center of the impact of this climate crisis are also the ones that face poverty issues. what are they hoping that world leaders could, could discuss and could agree to push ahead with this drive?
I think this is a difficult challenge because on the one hand, we see, one of perhaps the reasons why we haven't seen less success with Western-driven poverty alleviation efforts is I think that also you have the presence of chemical companies, et cetera. The companies that develop seeds also are in it to make money. So, and this of course puts them sometimes at odds with the farmer. And I think here we see a system like China, which is not just with agriculture, but healthcare, for example, where if you look at the cost of an operation, the cost of drugs, it's typically a fraction in China than it is in, say, like the United States. And dealing with these more structural economic / political system issues, I think, is a part of it as well, and probably a far more complex topic than we can cover here today, but certainly I think is a question that many countries in the global south are starting to think seriously about. And I think Lula in Brazil, of course, is known for his more independent thinking about what it's not just the seeds, it's not just the farm equipment, but it's the actual political economic structures that maybe are worth taking a look at as well.
Yeah, so many issues that we're discussing today require funding, and now live signal from the G20 Summit taking place in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. As we can see right there, Chinese President Xi Jinping is arriving at the venue of the summit. And Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva and his wife, First Lady Janja, are welcoming the guests.
The Leaders Summit obviously is the climax of the G20 process and the work carried out over the year in ministerial meetings, working groups, and engagement groups. We have a lot to expect today. We, of course, look forward to hearing what the Chinese president will speak about at the sessions. We're also monitoring 2 sessions that are happening today. The first one about reducing poverty and reducing hunger, as we talked about. Another session on
and there's also on sustainable development and green transition, of course, and capacity building, the reform of global institutions. These are issues that of crucial importance. And as we mentioned, they all require funding, and it really requires, wisdom and leadership from the G20 nations to see if they could agree on something substantial to help the world move around, go forward.
Obviously, in a written article published in a Brazilian newspaper, we got a peek into what the Chinese president could be talking about at the Leaders Summit this time. He said China is supportive of the global alliance against hunger and poverty, as we talked about, and that development should be at the center. Again, let's take our viewers straight back to Rio de Janeiro, where the Chinese president is arriving at the Leader Summit.
Red carpet is being rolled out for world leaders, very important gathering of the group of 20 major economies of the world, and many of them are arriving after their meeting in Lima in Peru. We talked about connectivity just now. This Chancay port in southwest of Lima is also connecting the railway from Brazil, and hopefully that together, by combining these 2 transportation links together, the Brazilian fruits and fruits from Peru as well will arrive in China much more quickly.
It's not just a quicker route between Peru and China, obviously, it's a quicker route between much of Latin America to Asia. So we're expecting to see what comes out of the G20 Leaders Summit, obviously. And we were talking about Global South participation at the summit this time, and one thing that they have voiced over and over again is the elevation of the Global South in the international stage. Professor Wang, what would mark a successful step in the right direction? Because this issue has been raised on other international platforms as well. We heard it at BRICS. We're hearing it again at G20. That there needs to be tangible progress for the Global South to have a bigger voice, a louder voice on the international stage, and that includes reforming international financial institutions. We're talking about the IMF, we're talking about the World Bank. It has to do with the voting share, it has to do with the leadership election, all of that. So far, we've seen very little progress in these reforms. What is being held up there?
Well, I would be cautiously optimistic. I think the real reform takes time. We might see incremental changes, but these incremental changes eventually will create a dramatic change that we will see probably in the future. Because if you look at the G20, which actually grew out of G7 in 1999, and it has already been an example to illustrate that developing countries were a very important part of global governance. That's why G7 countries needed the support and coordination of these other global South countries in the late 1990s, right? And recently, last year, the African Union formally joined G20, which is another illustration showcasing that Africa, but also a bigger part of the global South, is playing a very important role in global governance. At the same time, we've seen new institutions being built, right? And BRICS and the Shanghai Security Organization has also been transforming from a purely security organization to one that covers more comprehensive development issues as well. So overall, you see more institutions being available, you see bigger participation by global South countries. And back to G20, right? I think the reporter just mentioned that from 2022 to 2025, you have hosting presidencies being held by developing countries or countries from global South back to back, right? Ranging from Indonesia to India to this year Brazil and then to South Africa, which says something about the increasing participation by global South countries, but also about a policy sustainability. Why? Because when you have hosting presidencies by developing countries for 4 years, then you have more space, more room to have policies like hunger reduction, poverty reduction to really take roots, right? Compared to a situation where you have a developing country hosting G20 this year and next year moves on to a developed country who probably doesn't care so much or doesn't put issues that are concerned by developing countries on their priority agenda. So this all speaks about the importance of the participation, but also the existing institutions like G20 are really playing a critical role.
All right, Professor Wang, thank you so much. Let's take a look at what's happening on the sidelines of the summit in terms of bilateral meetings. Chinese President Xi Jinping has met with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer on the sidelines of the G20 Leaders Summit in Rio de Janeiro. During their talks, President Xi highlighted China's and Britain's vast space for cooperation. Xi Jinping pointed out that the world has entered a new period of turbulence and change. He said as permanent members of the UN Security Council and major economies in the world, China and the UK must shoulder the task of promoting their respective national development and also bear the responsibility of addressing global challenges. President Xi also stressed that the two countries have a large potential for cooperation in trade, investment, clean energy, financial services, medical care, and people's livelihood. He said the two sides should promote political settlement of hotspot issues, strengthen global governance of artificial intelligence, and contribute to promoting world economic growth and achieving common development of countries. Prime Minister Starmer said Britain and China share common interests and shoulder the responsibility for solving global challenges and maintaining world peace and development. He stressed that during the enduring and strong relationship between Britain and China is of great importance to both countries and the world. He also said the two countries adhere to multilateralism.
Well, global leaders from economic powerhouses in the Americas, Europe, Asia, and Africa will discuss and address some of the world's most pressing issues during this year's G20 Summit. How will developed countries and emerging economies coordinate their responsibilities? CGTN's Ule reports.
The G20, or the Group of 20, is an international bloc formed in 1999 by the world's 20 major countries and economies. Now it includes 7 of the most developed countries, 12 developing countries, and the European Union, with the African Union granted as a permanent member in 2023.
G20 is one of the most important international platforms for coordinating international economic cooperation. So it's very important vehicle for global governance.
Wang Lei from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences has been a key member of the Think Tank 20, a vehicle under the G20 framework to promote policy advice to the summit. Wang says global trade and economic data has shown the increasing strength and influence of the Global South.
According to the recently released IMF report, even for this year and for the coming years, the developing countries' general growth pace will be much higher than the developing countries in general.
Wang says most of these Global South countries have rich natural resources and high-quality human resources, but they face serious problems such as social inequality and poverty, and desperately need financing.
Of course, emerging markets are becoming more confident in fora like the G20, as you would expect, with the increasing economic clout that they also have. We do see rising tensions, particularly along geopolitical lines. We also see first signs of fragmentation of trade. So what we really need is multilateral cooperation.
From 2022 to 2025, the G20 Summit is held in Indonesia, India, Brazil, and South Africa. Many experts say the succession of the G20 presidencies held by emerging countries has also contributed to the affirmation of a Global South agenda in the G20.
On the one hand, the Global South will introduce more new vehicles in terms of multilateral governance. At the same time, it's also very important to further reform international mechanism.
Under the Brazilian presidency in the upcoming G20, there are three priorities: fighting inequality, promoting social inclusion, and fighting hunger. All will involve practical discussions and collaboration among involved countries and organizations. But how will developed countries and emerging economies better cooperate and shoulder their responsibilities when it comes to addressing global crises and challenges? Join us as we will head to Rio to learn more about the solutions to these pressing international issues. Wu Lei, CGTN, Beijing.
The G20 Summit puts Latin America in the spotlight. The region is positioned to display its voice on a world stage. CGTN's Alastair Boverstock reports.
As nations meet for the G20 Leaders Summit in Latin America, 3 countries from the region will be present at the summit: Brazil, Mexico and Argentina, making up more than 2/3 of Latin America's total $7 trillion GDP. Juan Ramón Jiménez is a former economist at the Bank of Mexico.
Latin America is growing at around 1%, and its 3 largest economies are stable when it comes to macroeconomy.
G20 host Brazil, the biggest economy in Latin America and the world's 7th largest at $2.4 trillion, is globally vital, according to agribusiness analyst Ignacio Bringas.
Within the G20, Brazil's economy has very solid agricultural foundations, boosted by its growing fossil fuel exports. By aligning its economic policies with global sustainability and trade goals, the country can play a vital role in international policy.
Neighbouring Argentina will be the only G20 economy to have contracted since last year's summit, given the austerity measures of President Javier Milei. Yet Jiménez says that may be cause for optimism.
During this stage of Milei's leadership, there is a contraction, but that will attract international capital because investors are seeing the cleanup that is occurring within the public sector finances, and the president's project should be given the benefit of the doubt.
In a new era of North American free trade, Mexico has received record levels of foreign direct investment in recent years. Yet, as the country's current government improves its industrial infrastructure to serve investors, its debt grows, a concern for economists.
While the peso is stable, that is more because of international trade and investment than good government economic policy. That's leading to greater amounts of international debt and less purchasing power within the actual economy.
With Latin America represented in Brazil, a region making up less than a tenth of the global economy may have a perfect platform to make its voice heard.
Within the G20, Latin America is not only a vital supplier of food, but also of the fossil fuels needed for food production. So it is a vital region for the development of the world's largest economies, like China and the US.
Alistair Baverstock, CGTN, Mexico City.
All right, now let's head over to Washington, D.C., where my colleague Poppy Mufutin tells us about the economic significance of the G20.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to our continuing coverage of the G20 Summit in Brazil. I'm Poppy Mufutin in Washington, D.C. Well, G20 members meeting in Brazil have economic clout like no other global group. But individually, some of its most advanced economies are lagging behind others. Owen Fairclough reports.
Final preparations for the G20 underway in Rio de Janeiro. As the world's 20 biggest economies, they represent around 80% of global economic output. No other forum drives that much gross domestic product collectively. But there are individual variations, with some advanced economies now lagging behind less developed peers.
While major economies like China, the US and India have been driving the most growth among G20 members, some big players such as the Republic of Korea and Germany are struggling.
But host Brazil hope members can direct their growth towards mitigating climate change that is visible on its doorstep.
The G20 also needs to be aligned with this mission, the mission of not allowing us to exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius in the Earth's temperature. We are already living under the effects of climate change, with extreme events in the Rio Grande do Sul, what is happening in the Pantanal, what is happening in the Amazon, too much drought, too much rain, and humanity paying a very high price.
And if some G20 members are struggling, the bloc's growth looks strong compared with some others. G20 output expanded 3.1% on an annual basis in the second quarter of this year, compared to just 0.8% for the European Union. Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Washington.
All right, let's take a closer look at what the main topics will be and what the leaders will be hoping to achieve. Joining us now is Anthony Chan, former chief economist at JP Morgan Chase. Anthony, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be with you.
Now, we heard that there are a number of global challenges that G20 member countries are facing. Give us a sense of what the importance is in this moment of reforming global economic governance structures.
Well, I think it's very important because we certainly have many of these organizations like the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, and others, the UN Security Council, that certainly have been facing some challenges in governance over the last couple of years. And to be able to sort of update that governance to sort of meet the challenges of our day is going to be very important for the G20 to meet the challenges that they are hoping to deal with over the next couple of years.
And in particular, what role, to your mind, should developed nations in particular be paying attention to, particularly with regards to global efforts at alleviating issues such as poverty around the world?
Well, I think that's very important because with all this poverty, one of the things that obviously occurs is that you have growing levels of inequality. And academic studies show that when you have growing inequality, what you have is growing political polarization. And of course, when you have political polarization, you also have consumer confidence going down, and that hinders economic growth. So you certainly want to make sure that you break that cycle, because the cycle is that increasing inequality leads to more polarization, which leads to slower economic growth. And it also makes it more challenging to govern countries when you have polarization. So that is very important. And of course, the climate change is important. So the force or the movement towards renewables, addressing climate change to make sure that there's energy and efficiency are crucial and paramount to the mission that the G20 countries have to meet, because those things are crucial to get economic growth to higher levels, which will in fact end up reducing poverty rates and also increase consumer welfare.
Now, you mentioned climate change there. Of course, that is top of mind at the G20 Summit, especially coming off the back of COP29 in Azerbaijan. So hugely important. But so are other issues such as high inflation. What do you think, in practical terms, partner countries need to be doing to be solving these issues in timely fashion as well?
Well, I think with regard to inflation, one of the things that they have to do is to basically increase their utilization, increase opportunities for productivity growth to be faster, to the extent that these developing countries become more intertwined with the overall global economy. We saw the introduction of the port in Peru. All those things are crucial in trying to help these countries gain the efficiency to be able to grow. And as they grow, they'll be able to grow with less inflation. Of course, the management of monetary and fiscal policy is important, but so is the development of the infrastructure needed to be able to compete at efficient levels that are consistent with stable growth and low levels of inflation are going to be very important.
So let's dive in a little bit deeper with regards to what the main challenges are in terms of ensuring economic growth for developing nations as well as developed nations, because presumably there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution.
Well, they're going to need funds in order to build the infrastructure, because in many instances when you want to grow faster, you need that infrastructure. And so whether they get it through the One Belt, One Road initiative, or they get monies from the World Bank or the IMF, they need those funds in order to have the necessary infrastructure to be able to compete in an efficient manner with other countries and continue to grow. So those things are very important. And so revamping and improving the funding opportunities for these organizations to help developing countries are going to be very important.
And at this particular moment in time, how hopeful are you that these goals kind of are achievable? In terms of making specific policy recommendations, what might you throw out there?
Well, I'm actually encouraged. China certainly is at the forefront of trying their best to basically have a greener economy, and also supporting renewables. I think that in the United States, I hope we'll also continue along those paths. I know that there is a new incoming administration and there's some concern, but I hope that once countries, especially the United States, realize the importance, that they will also join in with the rest of nations around the world towards sustainable energy and renewables, because that is the way to go. We only have one planet. We can't let the temperature continue to increase and get warmer, because that hinders future economic growth. So we hope that all countries, including the United States, will jump on board.
Right, that is an excellent point. And from your vantage point, what do you think investors are particularly keeping an eye on in terms of how economic growth should be kept buoyant?
I think that they're really worried whether or not these organizations like the IMF, the World Bank, and others will be able to support these developing countries to be able to develop their infrastructure so they can join the world, overall the world economy, and become efficient enough in order to be able to compete. They also will be looking to see the fiscal policies and the monetary policies to make sure these countries continue to remain responsible and they maintain the inflation rates, the fact that the central banks will also continue to pay close attention to make sure that their monetary policies and fiscal policies are consistent with low levels of inflation. You don't want to have a situation where monetary policy just gets out of control and inflation starts to increase. So I'm encouraged with the fact that central banks around the world are paying more attention to inflation. But at the same time, debt growth and financial stability are crucial, and that's something to be watching these developing countries over time.
Anthony Chan, many thanks for your insights there. Much appreciated. And that's it for now from here in Washington, D.C. I'm Poppy Mputing. Let's go back to Beijing now for more coverage.
Well, Poppy, thank you so much for that part. And that's all the time we have for our special program. We'd like to thank our guests here in the studio, Mr. Andy Mok and Professor Wang Xinsong. Appreciate your analysis.
Thank you so much. The G20 Summit has officially opened in Rio de Janeiro. The group's leaders will deliver speeches. They will discuss the fight against hunger and poverty, the reform of international institutions, and a fair energy transition. They will issue a declaration at the end of the summit.
And CGTN will certainly follow the sessions and activities on the sidelines and find out more about the event on our website and social media accounts. I'm Wang Mengmang in Beijing.
I'm Zhong Shi. Thank you so much for watching and stay with CGTN for more news.
See you later.